My son drove me to a nursing home on a Tuesday morning in March, walked me to a room with a stained ceiling tile and a roommate who didn't speak, and told me I was on his own. Then he changed his phone number before I even made it to the front desk to call him back. I sat there in a vinyl recliner that smelled like bleach and old coffee, 68 years old, wondering how the boy I taught to ride a bike on Riverside Drive could look me in the eye and walk away like I was a piece of furniture he no longer had room for. That was the easy part, though. The part that still keeps me up some nights isn't what he did to me. It's what happened 4 months later, when his brand new boss walked into that same building for a ribbon-cutting ceremony, took one look at my face, and went completely still. My name is Walter Meese. I'm 68 years old. I spent 41 years as a structural engineer here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I built half the overpasses your GPS routes you through without you ever knowing my name was on the drawings. I believed, for most of my life, that if you worked hard and raised your children right and never once asked anyone for anything you hadn't earned, the people you loved would show up for you when it mattered. I was wrong about that. Not about all of it, but about enough of it that it nearly broke me. I want to tell you about the moment that changed everything, because it's one I'll remember for the rest of my life, however many years I've got left. But first I have to back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand who I was before that Tuesday in March. I grew up on a farm outside Sapulpa, the kind of place where you learned to fix things because there wasn't money to replace them. My father drove a grain truck. My mother kept the books for 3 different families in town just to make ends meet. I got a scholarship to Oklahoma State in 1975, studied civil engineering, and by 1984 I'd started my own firm with a partner named Russ Vance. We called it Meese and Vance Structural Engineering, and we ran it out of a 2-room office on South Boston Avenue for the first 6 years before we finally moved somewhere bigger. By 2005, we had 31 employees and contracts with the Oklahoma Department of Transportation that kept us busy through 2 recessions. I married my wife, Dorothy, in 1978. We bought a 3-bedroom brick ranch on East 61st Place in a quiet part of Tulsa called Woodland Hills, and we raised one son there. Colton, born in 1982. Dorothy passed in November of 2021. Congestive heart failure, the kind that gives you time to say goodbye, but not enough time to feel ready for it. She was 71. I sat with her the last 6 weeks in a hospital room at St. Francis, and I want to tell you something about that time, because it matters for what comes later. Colton visited exactly 4 times in those 6 weeks. He lives 22 minutes away in Broken Arrow. My granddaughter Emily, his daughter, visited almost every single day after her nursing shifts ended. She was 24 then, working at Hillcrest Medical Center on the cardiac floor, and she'd come straight from a 12-hour shift still in her scrubs, sometimes falling asleep in the chair beside her grandmother's bed before she'd even said a word to me. I noticed that. I filed it away without knowing yet how much it would matter. After Dorothy died, I stayed in the house on East 61st Place alone. I want to be honest with you about those 2 years, because people romanticize grief, and I won't do that here. Some days were fine. I still played golf on Thursdays with 3 men I'd known since 1988. I still drove myself to church at Boston Avenue Methodist every Sunday. But some nights I sat in Dorothy's reading chair with the lamp off, and I won't pretend that wasn't its own kind of hard. Colton called maybe twice a month. Short calls. Practical ones. How's the house holding up, Dad? Did you get that gutter fixed? He never once asked how I was sleeping. Emily called every single Sunday evening at 7 o'clock, like clockwork, and stayed on the phone for 45 minutes to an hour every time. The fall happened on a Saturday morning in early March of last year. I was in the garage moving a stepladder to get at a box of Dorothy's Christmas decorations, and my left leg simply stopped listening to me halfway up the second rung. I don't remember hitting the concrete. I remember waking up on my back with my ears ringing and a warm feeling on the side of my head that turned out to be blood from a gash above my eyebrow. I managed to crawl to the kitchen and pull the phone off the counter and call 911 myself. The paramedics got there in 9 minutes. At St. Francis, they told me I'd had what they called a mild ischemic event, a small stroke, along with a concussion from the fall. My left side was weak for about 10 days. My speech slurred slightly for about a week. The doctor, a neurologist named Dr. Okafor, told me plainly that with physical therapy, I had every reason to expect a near-full recovery. Near full. Those were his exact words, and I want you to remember them, because they matter enormously to what my son did next. I called Colton from the hospital bed myself. I remember exactly what I said. I told him I'd had a small stroke, that I was expected to recover, that I'd probably need a few weeks of rehab before I went home. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Okay, Dad, I'll come by this weekend." He came by twice in the 11 days I was in that hospital. Emily came every day after her shift, sat with me, helped me with the little exercises the speech therapist gave me for my slurred words, brought me a milkshake from Brahms every single visit, because she remembered it was my favorite even though I hadn't had one since before Dorothy got sick. I didn't know it yet, but those milkshakes were the last purely simple, purely kind thing anyone did for me for a long, long while. On the 9th day, Colton showed up with a folder. Not flowers, not a card. A folder, the kind you buy at an Office Depot for $1, with papers inside that a lawyer I'd never met had drawn up. He sat down in the vinyl chair beside my bed and told me, in the calm, businesslike voice he used at work, that with my stroke and my age and the uncertainty of recovery, it would be smart, just smart, Dad, nothing dramatic, to give him power of attorney over my finances and my health decisions. Just temporarily, he said, just until I was back on my feet. I was still recovering my words at that point, still had a slight drag on the left side of my mouth, and I remember thinking that I trusted this boy, that I had raised this boy, that surely this was exactly what it looked like. A son protecting his father. I signed it. I didn't call my own attorney, a man named Grant Osei who'd handled my business dealings for over 20 years, because Colton told me there wasn't time, that the hospital needed it filed before I was discharged. I know now that wasn't true. I didn't know it then. I was discharged on a Thursday. Colton picked me up. He didn't take me home to East 61st Place. He told me, in the car, that the house had stairs and a garage where I'd already fallen once, and that it wasn't safe for me to be alone there while I finished recovering. He said he'd found me a wonderful short-term rehabilitation place, very highly rated, right off Sheridan Road. I believed him. I sat in the passenger seat of his truck, still weak on my left side, still working my mouth to get words out clean, and I believed my son was taking care of me. The place was called Whispering Pine Senior Living, a low brick building on East 51st Street, with a parking lot full of cracks nobody had patched in years. The lobby smelled like industrial carpet cleaner layered over something underneath it that no amount of cleaner ever quite got rid of. A woman at the front desk had me sign in, checked a clipboard, and told Colton, room 114, he'll be sharing with Mr. Petrovsky. I remember looking at my son and saying, slow, careful with my words, sharing? And Colton said, "It's temporary, Dad. Just till you're stronger." I didn't know it yet, but I would spend the next 4 months in that room. The first weeks weren't the worst part, if you can believe that. I threw myself into the physical therapy they offered twice a week. Worked with a young therapist named Marcus who told me my progress was better than most patients half my age. My speech came back almost entirely within 3 weeks. My left side strength came back within 6. By the 6-week mark, Dr. Okafor's office confirmed, on a follow-up visit Colton drove me to, that I had recovered to what the chart called functionally independent status. I asked Colton, right there in the parking lot afterward, when I could go home. He looked at his phone and said he'd look into it. That was in April. It was July before I understood he had no intention of ever answering that question honestly. I want to pause here and tell you about my roommate, because he matters to this story more than you'd think. Anton Petrovsky was 81, a retired machinist, sharp as anything even though his hip kept him from walking much. He didn't talk a lot, but when he did, it counted. About 6 weeks in, he said to me one evening, watching me stare at the ceiling tile with the water stain shaped like Ohio, "You keep waiting for him to come get you. He's not coming, Walter. I've seen this movie before." I told him he was wrong. I told him my son was just busy, that he had a big new job, that things would settle down. Anton just nodded slowly and went back to his crossword. I didn't know it yet, but he'd seen this exact thing happen to at least 4 other men in that building over the years. Here's what I found out, piece by piece, over those 4 months, mostly from paperwork Emily brought me and questions she asked on my behalf, because I was still locked out of my own accounts. Colton had listed the house on East 61st Place for sale 11 days after I signed that power of attorney. 11 days. It sold in June for $341,000 to a young couple with 2 kids, the kind of family Dorothy would have loved seeing move in. Colton used $62,000 of that to prepay 4 months at Whispering Pines, the cheapest tier of care they offered, Medicaid-adjacent pricing, a shared room with a stranger. I never saw a dollar of the remaining money. What I later learned, and I'll get to how, was that in the same month the house closed, Colton put a substantial down payment on a new house of his own in a neighborhood called Stone Canyon and financed a Ford F-250 with a check that traced back almost dollar for dollar to my closing statement. Grab a chair if you haven't already, because this is where it starts to turn. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge Stories. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because trust me, you want to see how this one ends. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and stay with me, because the man who walked through those doors 4 months later was someone I never expected to see again as long as I lived. Emily figured out something was wrong before I did, in a way, because she was the one who actually looked. She came to visit one Sunday evening in late May, sat on the edge of my bed instead of the vinyl chair, and asked me quietly, "Grandpa, did Dad ever talk to you about selling the house?" I told her what Colton had told me, that it was being kept for me, being handled while I recovered. She got very still. She told me she'd driven past East 61st Place 2 days earlier on her way home from a shift, and there was a moving truck in the driveway, and a family she'd never seen before was carrying a couch through the front door. My front door? My mother-in-law's dogwood tree, the one Dorothy planted the year Colton was born, still in the front yard, but somebody else's swing set already up in the back. I didn't say much that night. I want to be honest about that. I sat in that bed with the water-stained ceiling tile above me, and I felt something in my chest go very quiet and very cold. The way a room goes cold right before a storm hits, when the air pressure drops and the birds stop making noise. Emily asked me if I wanted her to call her father. I told her no. Not yet. I told her I needed to understand what I was actually looking at before I said a single word to him, because a man who's been lied to once needs to know the whole shape of the lie before he decides what to do about it. She nodded, and she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Grandpa, whatever this is, I'm not going anywhere. I don't care what Dad does." I didn't know it yet, but that promise from a 25-year-old cardiac nurse was about to become the single most important sentence anyone said to me that entire year. The following week, Emily helped me get in touch with Grant Osei, my longtime attorney, using her own phone because Colton had, months earlier, quietly changed the contact number on file at the facility to his own cell, meaning any call I tried to place through the front desk phone bounced through him first. Grant came to visit me in person on a Wednesday in June, sat across from me in the little visiting room they had near the dining hall, and listened while I told him everything. He didn't say much while I talked. When I finished, he opened his briefcase and said, "Walter, I want you to sign something for me today. Revocation of the power of attorney you signed in March. I'm filing it with the county tomorrow morning." I asked him if that was even possible, given how weak I'd been when I signed the original. He said, and I remember this exactly, "Walter, you were functionally independent within 6 weeks according to your own neurologist chart. There was no legitimate reason for that POA to still be active in June. None." I signed it. My hand didn't shake at all. What Grant pulled together over the following 3 weeks turned my quiet, cold feeling into something else entirely. Bank records showed the house sale, the $62,000 prepayment to Whispering Pines, and roughly $240,000 that moved directly into Colton's personal accounts within 8 days of closing. There was a $180,000 down payment on the house in Stone Canyon, closed the same month. There was a $41,000 Ford F-250 purchased with a check written the same week. Grant found emails, subpoenaed later through the civil filing, where Colton had corresponded with a real estate agent about listing my house a full 9 days before I even signed the power of attorney in that hospital room. 9 days before, meaning my son had already put my house on the market, in his head at least, before I'd agreed to anything at all. He'd walked into that hospital room with a folder and a calm voice, and he already knew exactly what he intended to do with everything I'd spent 41 years building. I didn't know all of that yet on the day Colton finally came to see me again, in the first week of July, nearly a month after I'd signed the revocation, though he didn't yet know it existed. He walked into room 114 wearing a golf shirt with a logo I didn't recognize, a company name stitched over the left chest. Vantage Point Construction. I asked him what that was. He told me, almost proudly, that he'd taken a new job as a senior project manager, a huge step up. Working under a CEO who'd built the company from nothing into one of the largest commercial construction firms in the Southwest. He said the man's name was Russell Cade. I remember nodding politely, filing the name away without thinking anything of it, because I had far bigger things on my mind that afternoon than my son's new employer. I asked him, straight out, when I was coming home. He looked at his phone the way he always did when he didn't want to answer a question, and he said, "Dad, honestly, I think this is home now. It's what's best. You're safe here. You're taken care of." I asked him about the house. He said, flatly, without a flicker of shame in his voice, "I sold it. It didn't make sense to keep paying taxes and insurance on an empty place while you're here." I asked him where the money went. And this is the moment, if you want to know the exact moment, that something in me finished closing. He said, "Dad, I handled it. You don't need to worry about the details. You're on your own with the day-to-day stuff now. That's just how it has to be. You're on your own." My own son said those words to me in a shared room that smelled like bleach for months after I'd trusted him with everything I had left in the world. And then he checked his watch, said he had a meeting, and left. 3 days later, when I tried calling the number I had for him, a recorded voice told me the number was no longer in service. I sat with that for a long time. I want to tell you I raged, that I threw something, that I demanded to see a supervisor. I didn't. I've built bridges for a living, and the thing about bridges is you don't build them out of anger. You build them out of load calculations and patience and knowing exactly where the stress is going to concentrate before it ever gets there. I told Grant Osei everything. I told Emily everything. And then I did the only thing that ever made sense to a man like me. I waited, and I let the evidence finish assembling itself, because I already knew, deep down, exactly what shape this was going to take once it was done. I didn't know it yet, but the piece that would finally break this whole thing open wasn't going to come from a lawyer or a bank statement. It was going to walk through the front doors of Whispering Pines Sr. living on a Thursday morning in late July, wearing a suit that cost more than everything in my closet combined, and stopped dead in the hallway the second he saw my face. Whispering Pines had been trying for 2 years to get a corporate sponsor to renovate its physical therapy wing, which was, frankly, a disgrace. 2 treadmills from the previous decade, parallel bars with peeling paint, a single set of resistance bands the therapists ration like they were gold. In late June, the administrator announced that a local construction company had agreed to fund a full renovation as part of a community outreach initiative, and that the company's CEO would personally attend the ribbon cutting once the work was finished. I remember hearing that announcement in the dining hall and thinking nothing of it at all. Rich men cut ribbons for tax write-offs all the time. I had no idea the company was Vantage Point Construction. I had no idea the CEO coming to cut that ribbon was the same man my son now worked under. The morning of the ceremony, the last Thursday in July, the staff had us all wheeled or walked into the newly finished therapy wing, fresh paint, new equipment still wrapped in plastic, a little podium set up near the window. I sat near the back in a folding chair Emily had pulled up for me, because she'd taken the morning off specifically to be there, and Colton, I later learned, had been asked by his new employer to attend as well, representing the project management team that had overseen the renovation on Vantage Point's side. Neither of us knew the other would be there. I hadn't spoken to my son in 3 weeks. The administrator gave a short speech. Then she introduced the CEO of Vantage Point Construction, a man named Russell Cade, who walked up to the podium in a gray suit, maybe 50 years old, gray at the temples, the kind of composed, easy confidence you only get from having survived something hard enough that nothing much rattles you afterward. He thanked the staff, thanked the residents for their patience during construction, and then, as he was finishing his remarks, his eyes drifted across the room the way a speaker's eyes do, sweeping the crowd out of habit. And they stopped on me. He stopped mid-sentence. I want you to understand, this was a man giving a polished, rehearsed speech to a room full of strangers, and he simply stopped talking. He stood there at that podium for what felt like a full 10 seconds, staring at an old man in a folding chair near the back wall. And then he said, into the microphone, in a voice that had gone suddenly unsteady, "I'm sorry. I need to pause for a moment." The room went quiet in that confused way rooms go quiet when something is happening that nobody yet understands. He stepped down from the podium, walked straight across that room, past the administrator, past the folding chairs, past my own son, who I could see out of the corner of my eye going very pale, and he stopped directly in front of me and said, "Walter Meese." Not a question. A statement, like a man confirming something he could hardly believe. I looked up at him, and I want to tell you honestly, it took me a moment. 41 years is a long career, and I've mentored more young engineers than I could ever count by name. But then he said, "South Boston Avenue. 1994. You gave me a job when nobody else in this city would even let me fill out an application, and it hit me like a physical thing." Let me back up, because you need the whole picture. In the spring of 1994, a young man named Russell Cade walked into the offices of Meese and Vance looking for any kind of work. He was 19 years old, had done 14 months at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester for a robbery charge he'd caught at 17 when he was running with the wrong crowd after his mother died and his father drank himself out of the picture. He had no diploma, no references anyone would return a call for, a record that got him turned away from every single place he'd tried. I remember him standing in our lobby, shifting his weight, waiting to be told to leave. My partner, Russ Vance, wanted nothing to do with it. "Liability," he said. I overruled him. I put Russell Cade on as a laborer clearing job sites, paid him $9 an hour, and within 4 months I noticed he was reading the structural drawings on his lunch breaks, teaching himself, asking questions no laborer had ever asked me before. I got him into a night program at Tulsa Community College. I co-signed a loan for his first set of textbooks because his credit didn't exist. I wrote him a letter of recommendation on Meese and Vance letterhead, staking my own professional reputation on a 19-year-old ex-convict. When the licensing board asked why a felon should be permitted to sit for an engineering technician certification, I told the board exactly what I believed, which was that a mistake a boy makes at 17 shouldn't be a life sentence if the man he becomes proves otherwise. He proved otherwise 100 times over. Russell worked under me for 6 years before he left to start his own small outfit in 2000, a two-man operation not unlike the one I'd started with Russ Vance back in 1984. I'd lost track of him over the following 2 decades, the way you lose track of a lot of people in a busy life, though I'd heard, once or twice, through mutual acquaintances in the construction trade, that he'd built something substantial. I had no idea it was Vantage Point. I had no idea it had grown into one of the largest firms in the region. And I certainly had no idea, sitting in that folding chair in a shared room I'd been dumped in by my own son, that the boy I'd vouched for 30 years earlier was about to walk back into my life at the exact moment I needed him most. He knelt down in front of my chair, right there in front of the whole room, in front of the administrator and the staff and the other residents and my own son standing frozen by the door, and he said, "Walter, what in God's name are you doing in a place like this?" And I looked at this man I hadn't seen in over 20 years, this man whose entire adult life had been built on a chance I'd given him when nobody else would, and I said, calm as I could manage, "That's a long story, Russell, and you're not going to like how it ends." He didn't leave. He sent his driver home, canceled 2 afternoon meetings right there on his phone, and sat with me in that visiting room near the dining hall for nearly 2 hours. Emily sat beside me the whole time. Colton did not stay. I watched my own son find a reason to slip out within 10 minutes of Russell kneeling in front of my chair, mumbling something about a site inspection he needed to get to, and I watched Russell watch him go, and I watched something shift in Russell's face, the particular look of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't like the answer to. I told him everything, in order, the way I'd tell a story to a room of engineers, facts first, emotion afterward. The stroke, the power of attorney. The house on East 61st Place sold 11 days later for $341,000. The $62,000 prepayment to the cheapest tier of care this facility offered. The $240,000 that disappeared into accounts I no longer had access to. The down payment on a house in Stone Canyon. The truck. The changed phone number. The words "you're on your own," spoken to me by my son in a shared room that smelled like bleach. Russell didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he sat back in his chair, ran a hand down his face, and said quietly, "Walter, do you understand who you just described to me? Colton Meese is my newest senior project manager. I hired him myself 6 weeks ago. I have his personnel file on my desk right now." I felt something cold settle into my stomach at that, because for one terrible moment I thought he was about to tell me he couldn't get involved, that it was a conflict, that this was between me and my son and none of his business. Instead, he leaned forward, put his hand on my arm, The same steady grip I remembered from a job site on South Boston Avenue 30 years earlier. And he said, "You gave me a job when I had a felony on my record and nothing else to my name. You put your own reputation behind mine when it cost you something to do it. I am not walking out of this room and pretending I didn't just watch a man do to his own father what nobody should ever do to anybody. Give me your attorney's number." Today, I want to stop here for a moment and tell you something about that afternoon, because it's the part people ask me about most. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like the tide had turned and I could finally relax. What I felt, sitting there with Russell Cade's hand on my arm and Emily's hand on my other one, was something quieter than that. Recognized. That's the word. After 4 months of being handled, managed, moved, and finally discarded by the one person who was supposed to protect me, I was, for the first time since that hospital bed in March, being looked at by someone who actually saw me. Russell called Grant Osei himself that same afternoon, and the two of them spoke for nearly an hour. Grant later told me it was one of the strangest and most useful phone calls of his entire career because Russell didn't just offer sympathy. He offered documentation. As Colton's employer, he had access to HR records showing the exact date Colton had listed his new address in Stone Canyon as his primary residence for payroll purposes, a date that lined up precisely with the closing on that house, 8 days after my property sold. He had records of Colton's company vehicle allowance being declined that same month because Colton had informed HR he'd just financed a personal truck and didn't need it. Small things. Administrative things. But every single one of them another brick in a wall Grant was building, and every single one of them handed over voluntarily by a man who had every professional and reputational reason to stay as far away from this mess as possible, and chose instead to walk straight into it. Here's what I didn't expect, and what I think surprised Russell too, if I'm honest. Within a week, word had clearly reached Colton that his boss and his father were now in direct contact, because Colton called me. Not the front desk. My own new cell phone, which Emily had bought me the week after the ribbon cutting, so I'd never again be cut off from the outside world by anyone. He was angry in a way I'd never heard from him before, tight and fast and defensive. "Dad, what did you tell Russell? Do you understand what you're doing to my career? I just got this job." I let him finish. I always let people finish, because a man who interrupts never learns the full shape of what he's dealing with. And then I said, calm as I could manage, "Colton," I told him the truth. The same truth I'm going to tell a judge, if it comes to that. You had power of attorney for 4 months. You sold my house 11 days after I signed it, while I was still recovering in a hospital bed. You kept $240,000 of my money and told me I was on my own. I didn't do this to your career, son. You did this to your career the day you decided your father's life savings were yours to spend. He hung up on me. I sat there holding that phone for a long time afterward, and I felt, more than anything else, tired. Not angry. Tired. The way you feel after finally setting down something heavy you've been carrying for far longer than you should have. Grant filed a civil suit for financial exploitation of an elderly person in the second week of August, along with a formal request that the county investigate criminal charges under Oklahoma's elder abuse statutes. The bank records, the real estate closing documents, and Russell's HR paperwork made the timeline airtight. Grant told me plainly that in cases like this, the hardest part is usually proving intent, proving the son or daughter knew exactly what they were doing and did it anyway. In our case, the emails Colton had sent to a real estate agent 9 full days before I ever signed anything did that work for us entirely. There was no ambiguity left. No room for Colton's lawyer, when he eventually hired one, to argue this had been a good faith mistake made under pressure. I didn't know it yet. But the hardest conversation of that entire summer wasn't going to be with Colton at all. It was going to be with Emily, on a Sunday evening in late August, sitting on the little bench outside the therapy wing Russell's company had just finished renovating, when she finally told me something she'd been carrying alone for weeks. She told me that back in April, before any of this had come apart, her father had asked her to stop visiting me so often, told her it was enabling me, that it was confusing the boundaries of my care, that the facility staff had complained I was too dependent on family visits and it was slowing my adjustment. She told me she'd nearly listened to him. She told me there'd been one week in May where she'd almost skipped her Sunday visit because he'd made her feel, in that particular way parents can make grown children feel, like she was doing something wrong by loving her grandfather too much. And then she told me why she came anyway that week and every week after. She said, "I looked at you in that bed, Grandpa, and I thought about every single Sunday call you ever answered when I was in nursing school crying about an exam I thought I'd failed. And I thought, whatever boundary Dad thinks I'm supposed to have, it isn't bigger than that." I didn't say anything for a moment, because I couldn't. I just reached over and took her hand, the way I used to take Dorothy's hand, and I held it for a long time on that bench, and I promised myself something right then that I intended to keep for the rest of however many years I had left. The civil case moved faster than Grant expected, largely because Colton's own attorney, once he saw the full evidence file, advised him to settle rather than let it go to trial and risk the criminal referral moving forward alongside it. In late September, a settlement was reached. Colton was required to return $226,000 of the misappropriated funds, the difference accounting for legal costs, and a partial offset for the $62,000 already paid toward my care, which the court agreed to credit against his liability. He was also required, as part of the settlement, to formally relinquish any future claim on my estate. Grant drew up a new will the same week. Not out of spite, out of clarity. Colton received exactly $1, a number Grant told me some elder law attorneys use specifically so no one can later claim he was simply forgotten by accident. Everything else, the remaining proceeds from the house, my retirement accounts, the value of my share in the firm I'd sold back in 2015, went into an irrevocable trust in Emily's name, along with a separate fund, seed money of $50,000, that I set up in partnership with Russell Cade to help pay tuition and certification costs for young men and women coming out of the Oklahoma corrections system who want a real trade and a real second chance. The same chance Russell got from me on South Boston Avenue in 1994. We named it the Second Span Fund. A bridge is called a span in engineering terms. I thought that fit. Russell didn't stop at making a phone call to my attorney, either, and this is the part one still find hard to talk about without my voice catching a little. 2 weeks after the ribbon cutting, once the revocation and the early stages of the civil filing were underway, he showed up at Whispering Pines on a Saturday, unannounced, no suit this time, just a work shirt with the Vantage Point logo, and he told me he wasn't there as anybody's boss or anybody's CEO. He was there as a man who owed another man a debt he'd never quite figured out how to repay. He told me Whispering Pines was a fine facility for people who genuinely needed the level of care it provided, but that I wasn't one of those people, hadn't been since roughly 6 weeks after my stroke, and that he wasn't going to let me sit out the rest of this fight in a shared room with a water stain on the ceiling. He'd already looked into an independent living community called Ashbury Court out near Woodland Hills, close to where my old house used to be, close enough that Emily's drive to see me would be 11 minutes instead of 25. He didn't offer to pay for it. He was careful about that, and I respected him more for the carefulness than I would have for the gesture itself. He simply drove me out there himself the following Tuesday, sat with me while I toured a bright one-bedroom unit with a small kitchen and a balcony that caught the morning sun, and waited while I signed the paperwork myself, with my own money, once the settlement funds cleared in October. I moved into Ashbury Court on the second Saturday of October. Emily helped me pack the few things I'd accumulated at Whispering Pines, and Anton Petrovsky, my old roommate, shook my hand at the door and told me, with something that might have been the closest thing to a smile I ever saw from him, "Told you he wasn't coming for you, Walter. Glad somebody finally did." I gave him my new number before I left. I still call him every other Thursday. I want to be honest with you about where things stand with Colton now, because I know some of you are waiting to hear that he showed up on my doorstep sobbing and everything got fixed. That's not what happened, and I don't think it's what real life usually does. He lost the job at Vantage Point in September, not fired outright, Russell told me later, but eased out through what the industry politely calls a mutual parting, once the settlement became a matter of public record in the county filings and a few people at the company put the pieces together. He kept the house in Stone Canyon. Technically, though I understand from Emily that the mortgage on it, combined with the settlement repayment, has put real strain on his marriage. She tells me her mother, Colton's wife, calls her sometimes now, quietly, on her own, still trying to understand how they got here. I don't know what becomes of that marriage. It isn't mine to fix, and I've stopped trying to fix things that were never mine to carry in the first place. Colton called me once more, in November, a short, stiff conversation where he told me he was sorry for how things had gone, using the passive kind of language people use when they want credit for an apology, without actually naming what they did. I listened. I told him I appreciated the call. I told him the door wasn't locked, but that it also wasn't going to open itself, and that the next move, if there was going to be one, needed to come from him showing up rather than explaining himself over the phone. He hasn't shown up yet. I don't know if he will. I've made my peace with either outcome, because I learned something in that shared room on East 51st Street that I don't think I ever fully understood before, not even after 41 years of building things that were meant to last. You can love someone with everything you've got and still not be owed their decency in return. Love doesn't purchase that. It only ever hopes for it. Emily got married this past June, out at a small venue near Broken Arrow, and I walked her down the aisle myself, my left leg fully recovered, not even a hint of a limp left over from that morning on the ladder. Russell Cade was there too, sitting near the front, because somewhere over the last year he stopped being my former apprentice and became something closer to the son I'd wished for, without either of us ever quite saying that out loud. He gave a short toast at the reception, and he told the room a story about a 19-year-old with a felony record and nothing to his name, and a man who looked at him and saw something worth building instead of something to be discarded. He raised his glass and said the debt he owed me could never really be repaid, only passed forward, and that the Second Span Fund had already put 6 young men and women through their first year of technical certification. I sat at that table with Emily's hand on my shoulder and Anton Petrovsky 2 seats down, because I'd invited him myself and hired a car to bring him, and I thought about Dorothy and how much she would have loved watching her granddaughter dance in that white dress under those string lights, and how she always did say that the people who show up for you in the small, unglamorous moments are the only ones whose love you can actually build a life on. I still drive out past East 61st Place sometimes, on quiet afternoons, and I look at the dogwood tree Dorothy planted the year Colton was born, still standing in that front yard, still blooming every spring for a family that has no idea what it cost to get there. I don't feel angry when I look at it anymore. I mostly feel grateful, in a strange and complicated way, that a house can hold that much history and still keep growing something beautiful for whoever comes next. Some bridges, once the load shifts too far past what they were built to carry, simply can't be repaired. You don't grieve that forever. You learn, instead, which supports were true all along, and you build everything that matters most on those instead. My name is Walter Meese. I spent 41 years teaching young engineers that no structure survives on hope alone, that it survives on what's actually holding it up underneath. It took me 68 years and one terrible spring to finally understand that the exact same rule applies to family.